Napoleon, A Life, by Andrew Roberts. Introduction. Imagine, for a moment, a young man, not yet 25 years old. He's an outsider, a political refugee from a small, rugged island, speaking his new country's language with a thick, almost comical accent. He has no money, no powerful family connections, nothing but a brilliant mind and a burning, all-consuming ambition. Now, imagine that same young man, just 6 years later, standing as the master of that country, one of the most powerful nations on earth. Imagine him rewriting its laws, reshaping its society, and leading its armies in a series of victories so dazzling they would be compared to those of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. This isn't a work of fiction. This is the story of Napoleon Bonaparte. There have been more books written with his name in the title than there have been days since his death in 1821. He is a giant of history, a figure who represents, as one historian put it, the Enlightenment on horseback. He was a military genius who fought 60 battles and lost only a handful. But his true legacy, the one that touches our lives even today, was forged not just on the battlefield, but in the council chambers. The very ideas that we take for granted, meritocracy, equality before the law, religious toleration, sound finances, modern secular education, were championed, consolidated, and codified by him. The Napoleonic Code, his greatest achievement, still forms the basis of law in dozens of countries across the globe. The bridges he built are still crossed, the institutions he created still stand. The author of the book we are exploring today, Andrew Roberts, is a historian who has dedicated years of his life to understanding this man. He didn't just study him from dusty archives, he walked the ground of 53 of Napoleon's 60 battlefields, from the sun-scorched sands of Egypt to the frozen plains of Russia. This book is the result of that immense dedication, a portrait of Napoleon that is both monumental and deeply human. So, who was this man? Was he a revolutionary hero who saved France from chaos, or a tyrant who bathed Europe in blood? Was he a visionary lawgiver or a megalomaniac driven by insatiable hubris? Over the next hour, we will journey together through his extraordinary life. We won't just list battles and dates. We will seek to understand the heart of the man. We will uncover the secrets of his leadership, the source of his ambition, and the fatal flaws that led to his dramatic downfall. By the end of our time together, you will not only understand why Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most compelling figures in history, but you will also hold a key to understanding the nature of power, ambition, and the making of the modern world itself. This is more than a history lesson. It's a story about what one person can achieve, for good and for ill, when they seize their destiny. Book summary. Our story begins not in the glittering halls of Paris, but on a rugged, sun-drenched island in the Mediterranean, Corsica. Napoleone di Bonaparte was born in Ajaccio in 1769, a son of the minor nobility in a land of fierce clan loyalties and a deep-seated spirit of independence. His family was respectable but far from wealthy, part of the island's gentry. Young Napoleon grew up with a fiery pride in his homeland, a land that had, just before his birth, been sold by the Italian city-state of Genoa to France. His father, Carlo, was a handsome, educated lawyer who had once been a supporter of the Corsican nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli. But after the French crushed the Corsican resistance, Carlo made a pragmatic choice. He swore allegiance to King Louis XV of France. It was a decision that branded him a collaborator in the eyes of some, but it opened doors for his children. For Napoleon, it was this act that set him on his path. It allowed him to secure a royal bursary to attend military school in France, to become a French officer and gentleman. At the age of 9, Napoleon left his home for the mainland. He was an outsider in every sense. At the military school of Brienne, he was teased for his thick Corsican accent, his unusual name, and his relative poverty compared to the sons of the French aristocracy. He was a solitary, proud, and often gloomy boy who found his true companions not on the playground, but in the library. He devoured books on history and biography, especially the lives of the great men of antiquity. Plutarch's tales of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar filled his imagination. He saw himself in them. He felt, even then, that he was capable of achieving as much as they had. History, for him, was not a subject to be studied, but a script to be lived. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, and it was the single greatest opportunity of Napoleon's life. For an ambitious young officer without connections, the revolution was a godsend. It swept away the old order of privilege and birthright and promised a new world where talent was all that mattered. Napoleon, despite being a nobleman, embraced the revolution's ideals of equality and meritocracy. He saw it as a chance for Corsica to gain greater autonomy, and for himself to make his mark. He threw himself into the turbulent politics of his homeland, but his revolutionary fervor and his lingering Corsican nationalism put him on a collision course with his childhood hero, Paoli, who had returned from exile. The clash was inevitable. Paoli was a man of the old world, wary of the radicalism of Paris. Napoleon was a man of the new, who saw France as the engine of progress. The final break came in 1793, when the Bonaparte family was declared an enemy of Corsica and forced to flee the island. They arrived in Toulon as political refugees, with almost nothing to their name. Napoleon, now fully committed to his French identity, knew his future lay not on his small island, but on the grand stage of continental Europe. His first great chance came that very year, at the siege of Toulon. The city, a vital naval base, had risen against the revolutionary government and invited in the British fleet. The French army besieging it was in disarray, led by an incompetent general who was a former painter. Napoleon, then just a 24-year-old artillery captain, saw with startling clarity what needed to be done. The key, he realized, was not to attack the city itself, but to capture the forts overlooking the harbor. From there, his cannon could rain fire down on the British ships, forcing them to either withdraw or be destroyed. He worked with a furious, relentless energy, gathering guns, training gunners, and building batteries, often under enemy fire. He showed immense personal bravery, even being wounded by an English bayonet in the thigh. His plan was brilliant, and it worked perfectly. The forts were taken, the British fleet was forced to evacuate, and Toulon fell. For his pivotal role, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. He was no longer an unknown, he was a hero of the Republic. But it was in Italy, in 1796, that the legend of Napoleon was truly forged. Given command of the ragtag army of Italy, he found his troops in a pitiful state, unpaid, starving, and demoralized. In a series of electrifying proclamations, he promised them glory and riches in the fertile plains of Lombardy. "Soldiers," he declared, "you are naked, ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world." What followed was one of the most astonishing campaigns in military history. Facing larger Austrian and Piedmontese armies, Napoleon moved with a speed that baffled his opponents. He used the strategy of the central position, keeping his army between his two enemies and striking first at one, then the other, before they could unite. His victories came in a torrent: Montanati, Millesimo, Dago. The most iconic moment of that campaign came at the Bridge of Lodi. Facing a storm of Austrian cannon fire, he personally grabbed a flag and led his grenadiers in a charge across a narrow wooden bridge. It was an act of incredible bravery, and it was after this battle that his soldiers, in a sign of their deep affection and admiration, gave him the nickname Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. It was after Lodi, Napoleon later said, that the first spark of high ambition was born. He no longer saw himself as a mere general, but as a man of destiny, a man who could shape the fate of nations. His Italian campaign was a masterclass in warfare, but it was also a lesson in politics. He set up sister republics, kindling the first flames of Italian nationalism, and he plundered Italy's artistic treasures, sending masterpieces by Michelangelo, Titian, and Leonardo da Vinci back to Paris to fill the galleries of the Louvre. He was not just a conqueror, he was a creator and a collector, on a grand scale. It was also in Italy that Napoleon fell deeply, obsessively in love. The object of his affection was Josephine de Beauharnais, a beautiful, charming, and well-connected widow 6 years his senior. She was a survivor of the Terror, having narrowly escaped the guillotine that had claimed her first husband. Napoleon's letters to her from the campaign are a torrent of passion, a mixture of desperate longing and jealous insecurity. "I awake full of you," he wrote. "Your portrait and the memory of last night's intoxicating evening have left my senses no rest." Josephine, however, did not return his passion, at least not at first. While he was winning battles, she was in Paris, enjoying the attentions of another man. The discovery of her infidelity, which he learned of while on campaign in the middle of the Egyptian desert, would leave a deep and permanent scar on his soul. Why Egypt? Having secured Italy and forced Austria to make peace, Napoleon returned to Paris a hero. But the Directory, the corrupt and unstable government of France, saw him as a threat. They needed to get him out of the political spotlight. The idea of an expedition to Egypt was born, a grand, romantic adventure that appealed to Napoleon's love of history and his desire to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. It was also a strategic move, a way to threaten Britain's trade routes to India. He sailed in 1798 with an army and a small army of scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers, who would produce the monumental Description de l'Égypte, a work that would unlock the secrets of the ancient pharaohs for the modern world. The campaign began with a stunning victory at the Battle of the Pyramids, where his disciplined French squares broke the charge of the fearsome Mamluk cavalry. "Soldiers," he famously declared, "from the top of those pyramids, 40 centuries are contemplating you." But the Egyptian dream quickly turned into a nightmare. A few weeks after he landed, Admiral Nelson destroyed his fleet at the Battle of the Nile, cutting him off from France. It was here, trapped in Egypt, that he received the devastating news of Josephine's affair. "I have a great, great deal of domestic sorrow," he wrote to his brother Joseph, "as now the veil has been completely lifted." He took a mistress, Pauline Ferrès, the wife of one of his officers, whom his soldiers nicknamed Cleopatra. He invaded Syria, but his ambition was checked at the ancient city of Acre, where a determined defense, aided by the British Navy, forced him into his first major defeat. He returned to Egypt, defeated another Ottoman army at Abu Qir, and then, learning of the political chaos back in France, he abandoned his army and made a daring secret voyage back home. He returned to France not as a defeated general, but as the nation's last hope. The Directory was on the verge of collapse, plagued by corruption and military defeats. France was weary of a decade of revolution and war. It was ready for a leader. The moment came on November 9, 1799, the 18th Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar. In a chaotic and messy coup d'état, Napoleon, with the help of his brother Lucien and other conspirators, overthrew the Directory. He was nearly mobbed by angry deputies in the legislative chamber, but the bayonets of his grenadiers saved the day. Out of the ashes of the revolution, a new government arose, the Consulate. And at its head, as first consul, stood Napoleon Bonaparte. He was just 30 years old. "We have done with the romance of the revolution," Napoleon told his council. "We must now commence its history." As first consul, he worked with an almost superhuman energy. He was a master administrator, a micromanager who involved himself in every detail of the state, from the grand strategy of armies to the regulations of the national theater. His greatest and most enduring achievement was the Napoleonic Code, a single, unified body of law that replaced the chaotic tangle of feudal and royal laws that had governed France for centuries. The Code enshrined the core principles of the Revolution: equality before the law, the rights of property, and religious toleration. It was a work of such clarity and brilliance that it was adopted across Europe and continues to influence legal systems around the world. It is his true claim to immortality. He healed the deep wounds of the Revolution by signing the Concordat with the Pope, restoring the Catholic Church in France but keeping it firmly under state control. He stabilized the nation's finances, created the Banque de France, and established a system of state secondary schools, the lycées, to train the next generation of leaders. He was building a new France, a modern, centralized state built on a foundation of granite. He also brought peace, at least for a time. At the Battle of Marengo in 1800, he snatched victory from the jaws of defeat against the Austrians, securing his rule and once again demonstrating his military genius. The Peace of Amiens with Britain in 1802 brought a brief, welcome respite from a decade of war. But peace could not last. The old monarchies of Europe saw Napoleon as the embodiment of the revolution, a dangerous upstart who threatened their very existence. And Napoleon, for his part, could not rest. His ambition was boundless. In 1804, he took the final, decisive step. In a magnificent ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, in the presence of the Pope, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. He had restored monarchy, but it was a new kind of monarchy, one based not on divine right, but on the will of the people, expressed through plebiscites, and on the power of his own genius. The year 1805 saw Napoleon at the very height of his powers. Facing a third coalition of Austria, Russia, and Britain, he marched his Grande Army from the shores of the English Channel to the heart of Central Europe with breathtaking speed. At the Battle of Austerlitz, on the first anniversary of his coronation, he won his most brilliant victory. In a tactical masterpiece, he lured the Austro-Russian army into a trap, shattering their center and inflicting a devastating defeat. "Soldiers," he proclaimed, "I am satisfied with you. You have decorated your eagles with an immortal glory." The following year, he smashed the supposedly invincible Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. In 1807, after a brutal winter campaign in Poland, he defeated the Russians again at Friedland. At Tilsit, on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, he met Tsar Alexander I and forged an alliance that effectively divided Europe between them. He was the master of the continent. His empire stretched from Spain to Poland. He placed his brothers and marshals on the thrones of Europe, Joseph in Naples and then Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia, Murat in Naples. He created a new aristocracy based on merit, the Légion d'honneur, rewarding the talent and bravery of his soldiers and citizens. He seemed unstoppable. But even at this zenith of his power, the seeds of his destruction were being sown. The first was what he would later call the Spanish ulcer. In 1808, he made a disastrous miscalculation. He deposed the Spanish royal family and placed his brother Joseph on the throne, expecting the Spanish people to welcome his modernizing reforms. Instead, he ignited a firestorm of popular resistance. The Spanish rose up in a brutal guerrilla war, a war to the knife, aided by a British army under the command of a general who would become Napoleon's ultimate nemesis, the Duke of Wellington. The war in Spain would drain France of men and money for years, a running sore that would never heal. The second seed was his own creation, the continental system. In an attempt to wage economic warfare against his last remaining enemy, Great Britain, he forbade all of Europe from trading with her. It was a grand, ambitious plan, but it was impossible to enforce. Smuggling was rampant, and the system backfired, hurting the economies of his allies and stoking resentment against French rule. It was his obsession with enforcing this system that would eventually lead him to his most fatal error. By 1810, his personal life was also at a turning point. Desperate for an heir to secure his dynasty, and with Josephine now in her mid-40s and unable to give him one, he made the agonizing decision to divorce her. "Do not doubt my love," he told her, "but it is a victory I must win for the future of France." He then married the Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of his old enemy, Emperor Francis. She was young, she was a Habsburg, and in 1811, she gave him what he desired most: a son, Napoleon II, the King of Rome. His dynasty seemed secure. His empire was at its greatest extent. But his relationship with his most important ally, Tsar Alexander, was breaking down. The Tsar was chafing under the economic hardship of the continental system and was wary of Napoleon's ambitions in Poland. Napoleon saw Russia's defiance as a threat to his entire imperial system. He believed he had to make an example of her. In the summer of 1812, he assembled the largest European army ever seen, the Grande Army of over 500,000 men, drawn from 20 nations, and marched on Russia. It was an army of unprecedented scale, and it was a gamble of epic proportions. "I will strike one great blow," he believed, "and it will all be over." But the Russians refused to play by his rules. Instead of standing and fighting, they retreated, deeper and deeper into the vastness of Russia, drawing him ever further from his supply bases. They adopted a scorched earth policy, burning their own villages and crops, leaving nothing for the invaders. The Grande Army, which had always lived off the land, began to starve. Disease, especially typhus, ravaged its ranks. Napoleon finally got his great battle at Borodino, just outside Moscow. It was a bloodbath, the single deadliest day of the Napoleonic Wars. The French won the field, but the Russian army was not destroyed. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting the Tsar to sue for peace. Instead, he found a deserted city, which the Russians then set on fire. He waited in the smoldering ruins for 5 weeks for a peace offer that never came. Finally, with winter approaching, he was forced to begin the long retreat. What followed was a catastrophe of unimaginable horror. The Russian winter, which arrived early and with brutal ferocity, combined with starvation and relentless attacks from Cossacks, destroyed the Grande Army. Of the more than 500,000 men who had invaded, fewer than 100,000 stumbled back across the Niemen River. The spell of Napoleon's invincibility was broken. Europe sensed its chance. Prussia, and then Austria, joined Russia and Britain in a new, Sixth Coalition. In October 1813, at the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, Napoleon was decisively defeated in a massive 3-day battle by the combined Allied armies. He was forced to retreat back to France. In the spring of 1814, with France invaded from all sides, Napoleon fought one of his most brilliant campaigns, a whirlwind of victories against vastly superior numbers. But it was too late. His own marshals, weary of endless war, turned against him. Betrayed and abandoned, he was forced to abdicate. He was exiled to the small island of Elba, off the coast of Italy, which he was given as his own tiny kingdom. The old monarchies were restored, and the world breathed a sigh of relief, believing the age of Napoleon was finally over. They were wrong. Less than a year later, in March 1815, he escaped. He landed in France with 1,000 men and began a march on Paris that has become the stuff of legend. The soldiers sent to stop him threw down their arms and joined him. His old marshal, Ney, who had promised the Bourbon king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, defected with his entire army. Without a single shot being fired, Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace and was once again Emperor of the French. It was a glorious romantic comeback, but it was doomed. Europe would not tolerate his return. The Allies declared him an outlaw and assembled their armies once more. The final act of this grand drama was played out on a small patch of Belgian farmland on June 18, 1815, the battlefield of Waterloo. Facing an Anglo-Dutch army under Wellington and a Prussian army under Blücher, Napoleon fought his last battle. It was a close-run thing, a titanic struggle that hung in the balance for hours. But in the end, the stubborn defense of the British infantry and the timely arrival of the Prussians turned the tide. The Imperial Guard, his final reserve, broke and fled. The Grande Army was routed. His political life was over. He fled to the coast, and this time, he surrendered to his most constant enemy, the British. They would take no more chances. He was exiled to the remote, windswept rock of St. Helena, a tiny island in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from anywhere. There, guarded by British soldiers, he spent the last 6 years of his life, fighting his final campaign, a war of words, dictating his memoirs, shaping his legend for posterity. He died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, probably of stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. Commentary. What, then, are we to make of this extraordinary life? Napoleon Bonaparte was a man of profound contradictions. He was a son of the Revolution who became a monarch, a liberator who became a despot, a man who brought both enlightenment and war to Europe. His legacy is as complex and contested as the man himself. In France, he is remembered as a national hero, the founder of modern France. In much of the rest of Europe, he is remembered as a tyrant, the man who unleashed 2 decades of bloodshed. Both views contain a truth. The most powerful lesson from Napoleon's life is perhaps about the nature of ambition. His rise shows us that talent, energy, and an iron will can overcome any obstacle. He was a master of opportunity, a man who saw the chaos of his times not as a threat, but as a ladder. For any young person, his relentless work ethic, his deep study of his craft, and his unshakable self-belief are powerful sources of inspiration. He shows us that we are not merely products of our circumstances, we have the power to shape them. But his fall is a cautionary tale. It shows us that unchecked ambition, a belief in one's own infallibility, and a contempt for the limits of power can lead to ruin. He conquered an empire, but he could not conquer his own desire for more. He won almost every battle, but he lost the final war because he could not conceive of a world that was not centered on his own glory. He reminds us that the greatest victories are often not over others, but over ourselves. So, what can you, a young person on the cusp of your own life's journey, take from his story? First, the power of knowledge. Napoleon was not just a soldier, he was a voracious reader who studied history, law, and science with a passion. His victories were won not just with cannons, but with ideas. He understood that to lead, you must first learn. So, read widely. Study the great lives that came before you. See history not as a collection of dusty facts, but as a source of wisdom and a guide to action. Second, the importance of action. Napoleon was never a passive observer. He was a man of immense energy who acted decisively. Don't wait for the perfect moment, it will never come. Make a plan, but be prepared to adapt. Seize the opportunities that come your way, and create your own when they don't. But finally, and most importantly, the necessity of humility. Napoleon's story is a powerful reminder that pride comes before a fall. Listen to others, especially those who disagree with you. Understand your own limitations. Know when to stop. True strength is not about never failing. It's about having the wisdom to know when you have gone too far, and the courage to change course. Napoleon Bonaparte's life was a grand, epic, and ultimately tragic drama. He reached for the stars, and for a time, he held them in his grasp. But in the end, He was consumed by the very fire that had fueled his rise. His story is a timeless lesson in the heights to which a human being can soar, and the depths to which they can fall. It is a story that, once you have truly understood it, you will never forget. That was a summary of Napoleon, A Life by Andrew Roberts. We've covered the grand sweep of his life today, but a summary is like looking at a mountain from a distance. The real adventure, the real understanding, comes when you walk the paths yourself. The magic of a great book is in the small details, the quiet moments when a single sentence or a forgotten story connects with you in a way you never expected. This overview is your map, to help you decide if this is a mountain worth climbing. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to get a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an experience that can change how you think about leadership, ambition, and your own potential. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey into the life of a history maker valuable, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration of another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's continue to learn and grow together.